We'll
Hi,
cut that
Brian.
part out too. How are you doing?
Pretty good. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing
Better. Doing better now. I'm going to say, I'm at some point during this conversation, I'm going to say Brian's, and you're going to hear it and talk, or I'm going to say Brian, and Brian's just going to hear that and talk.
Yeah.
And I just want to apologize in advance.
Yeah. Do we want to just? I have a nickname for these days. Do you just want to call me T?
What if we just call you BT, because T is too much?
I'll take it.
How about-
That's because it's the
how about
Titanfall
T-Bone?
droid.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Brian, with an N,
What do you need?
you're joining us. You're the game director on Tyranny, published by Paradox, and you are at Obsidian, which developed the game. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and about how you got into game dev?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, started playing games from a very, very young age, and basically grew up playing games, spent probably far too many late nights playing games in school, and got some low grades as a result of that. Went to school, got a programming degree, and never really thought I'd be able to do anything with it. And then when I was in school, I was playing an online game and would post on the forums with just random ideas like bugs and issues and things. And finally, one of the developers is like, "Hey, you're pretty mouthy. Why don't you just apply for a position and fix it for yourself?" It's like, okay, I'll do that.
What game was that?
It was actually an online game back on America Online called Dragon Realms. It was a fantasy text-based game. This was back when those were the height of online gaming, before Ultima Online came out and showed that, graphics and gameplay can work too.
Who would have thought?
I know, amazing. Not like single-player games been doing that for years beforehand at all.
Yeah.
But so I started working on that and kind of taught myself how to program by working for that game, and then went on to get a degree in programming. And when I was actually getting ready to graduate, thought, hey, I'll look for a real job in the game industry, and ended up working at Westwood Studios on Earth and Beyond, another MMO.
Nice.
And then from there, just been various places throughout the industry, and now working here at Obsidian.
Yeah. And how long have you been at Obsidian then, working on RPGs?
Well, this is actually my second time working at Obsidian. I've been here almost 5 years at this point, and I worked here briefly in 2004, 2005 on a project that was canceled, and then very briefly on the early pre-production of Alpha Protocol.
Oh, okay. So Tyranny just came out somewhat recently. Can you tell us a little bit about the game for people who aren't familiar?
Yes, I mean, Tyranny is an isometric role-playing game in the same vein as like Pillars of Eternity that came out last year, and classics like Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale. The main thing that we're doing very differently with Tyranny is that we have the premise of the world is that evil has won. Like, the grand struggle between good and evil is over, and the Overlord triumphed, and you were part of the conquering army that led to the Overlord's victory. So you kind of begin the game as part of the evil empire. You're part of evil middle management, effectively. And as you're playing through the game, you have to decide whether you want to keep your involvement in that evil bureaucracy, whether you want to rebel against it, or really double down and try and crush any resistance to the Overlord's rule.
So,
Go ahead, Alex.
well, what I want to know is how did you come to be the director on this project? Like, because if viewers don't know, like, this project has sort of a long history at the studio, right? I mean, the ideas that went into this have been kicking around in some form or another for, I think, a decade, right? Like 2006.
For quite a while, yes. Mm-hmm. So the first time I worked at Obsidian, that was again a project that was canceled. But it was like while they were working on Neverwinter Nights 2, and after Knights of the Old Republic 2 had released, and I would talk with various of the owners about, like, if I got to make my Star Wars game, what it would be. And the thing that I always wanted to do, rather than doing the whole like light side versus dark side choice, is really just focus on the dark side. Get to play the Emperor. Get to have the evil plan that I'm enacting by manipulating people throughout the world. And so I think after when I came back, I was working on South Park Stick of Truth, which is its own brand of evil, its own the type of humor it has. So when I was working on that, we were looking at what we like other projects that the studio could work on, and this was after a large project had been canceled, and the core team of that had gone on to work on the Kickstarter for Pillars of Eternity, and that took off and was really successful. And it kind of showed that several publishers that this type of game could be successful and would have an audience. So we were working with like pitches for various different games and various different publishers, and the idea for Tyranny, like that core concept of like a world where evil had won, had kind of been around the studio in various permutations throughout the years, and we decided to really like pick it up and run with it again and turn it into the world that became the world of Tyranny.
Right on.
So I want to talk about that when you were pitching to publishers and you're starting to want to do an isometric RPG here in post 2005 like era. Can you talk about the appeal, because there was a time it's kind of like you have huge sprawling first person RPGs, but there continues to be an appeal for the isometric kind of classic format. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I think the appeal always existed. I don't think that the desire for people to play this type of game ever really went away. I think it became more of a business thing, and this is something that Fergus Urquhart, our CEO, has talked about in various interviews, that the budget and margin on these games is not in like the publisher's sweet spot. That for a lot of the larger publishers, like either there's the smaller mobile titles or the giant console RPGs that are going to sell $12-13 million. Like that's where they want to spend their money. And this type of game falls into this middle zone where the budget is smaller, is like bigger than a mobile title, but smaller than like a massive RPG, and the return is less than they're going to expect from like a Skyrim or a Fallout 4. So it was very hard to get a publisher interested in funding this type of game because it just the money in the return wasn't there for them. That they didn't see the reason to put their money towards this versus a smaller or a larger title. And then with the surgence of crowdfunding with like Wasteland 2, Divinity: Original Sin, and Pillars, helped show several publishers that there actually is a large enough audience they could make some money on this. And we ended up working with Paradox, who is they have like their core audience of grand strategy games with things like Hearts of Iron, Crusader Kings, that sort of thing. And they love RPGs, they love playing RPGs, and they wanted to start looking at making one and developing experience with working on RPGs as well. So, and the type of budget for this game was in their wheelhouse for the type that they like to spend on funding and publishing a game. So it just worked out really well that with the success of Pillars and developing relationships with Paradox, we really came together and said, okay, we can now make another RPG that actually we can get funding from a publisher to develop and reuse a lot of the tech we developed for Pillars of Eternity, which really allowed us to save a lot of time and energy in developing the game and just focus on making the game what it was.
Yeah, I think like one thing we all want to know is what it's like to make a role-playing game where you are bad. Like you're just a bad person hanging out with bad people, and there's like you have to really dig to find anyone that is what you might call like moral. Good. Like I imagine that you must have like a slate of stories about like conversations you had during development, or like arguments or problems and challenges. Like what should people know about the challenges that come with trying to make a game like this intriguing and interesting to play?
So I think one of the things that actually really helped for developing Tyranny is that a lot of the team, especially the design team, worked on South Park. And after working on that game, there are no filters anymore. Like it basically broke down every shred of decency we might have left as human beings. So, basically at that point, talking about a character being evil, like this is not that much of a stretch. Like the things we would talk about having people do after some of the design discussions we would have that were legitimate design discussions and not like HR fireable offenses that we would have on South Park. Working on a game about evil is just child's play at that point. So
I know we're here for Tyranny, but I want to hear some of this stuff that happened the development of South Park.
Well, I mean, have you played Stick of Truth?
Yeah, okay. I guess I can get an idea of the conversations that went on.
Well, I mean, just imagine a design team discussion trying to design the layout for the Mr. Slave levels.
Oh, jeez.
So, like, what's so interesting to me?
Kind of break down the barriers that you might have normally as a designer in a company.
Right.
But so South Park is like evil for catharsis, right? Like it's humor. It's a goof, and it can be really disturbing if you take it seriously, but like you're usually not meant to. Whereas this game, it doesn't have, at least up front, that veneer of humor and just goofy childishness. Like it does treat with some pretty serious topics, like wanton mass murder and mostly just murder, really, slavery and murder. And it's pretty light about it, but I wouldn't say it's humorous. So how did you walk that line, or how did your team walk that line in trying to make it approachable and not terrible, but also not a big goof?
So I think, absolutely, Tyranny is much more of a serious game than South Park was, and deliberately so. And one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to give players an experience of playing an evil character, but we didn't want to trivialize what evil was. So we didn't want to turn into this obviously RPGs are a power fantasy, and one of the things we promised the player from the very beginning is that they begin the game as a person of importance and someone who's powerful in this evil empire. And we want to make that fun and interesting for players as well. But we don't try to sugarcoat what the consequences of your decisions are. So when you choose to have someone killed, there can be a fairly explicit description of exactly how that person dies and why it's not this fade to black romanticized notion of an execution that might happen on a on a TV show where you don't actually see the brutality of what happens. That was actually important for us to show that we're not trying to romanticize evil. We're trying to, through our dialogue systems and reputation systems, explore some of the ways that evil happens, which is when you are just treat everything as impersonal or look out for your own advantage or your own self-interest, it's very easy to be swayed to making very awful decisions. And sometimes you're faced with decisions where you don't have all the information. You don't always know the consequences of the decision you're going to make. And that's real life. That is how a lot of decisions get made, where you try to make the best choice you can given imperfect information, and sometimes something awful comes out as a result of that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. The storyline of this game, the protagonists and the characters you meet, they don't laugh at violence. They're just inured to it. It's just pedestrian at this point. And so, as somebody who doesn't feel that way in real life, there's one character that I stopped taking with me because something she said was so, a part of her background was so terrible, and she was so just blasé about it. But as a game director and as a creator, was that stressful at all to constantly be working on something like this and trying to figure out ways to make horrible things seem pedestrian while trying to just make a game for however long it took, a year or so?
So actually, Tyranny's been in development. I've been on the project for almost 3 years at this point.
Okay.
So in some ways, it wasn't. There was obviously stress involved in making the game, of trying to meet deadlines and get game systems to work and function. With any job, there's going to be a certain level of stress, but a lot of the things you're experiencing while playing the game over the course of 20 to 30 hours is stuff that we worked on over the course of 2 to 3 years. So a lot of those discussions and moments, we have some buffer time in between when we discuss the moments and when they're actually implemented. So it's not like we're making those decisions back to back over the course of 20 hours. So it's not we're not always approaching it with the exact same level of intensity that a player will, because they are experiencing it very close to each other. And that's one of the things that, as we're developing the game and we're doing play tests, we're looking at hey, we made these choices 2 years apart. How do they actually feel as a player when you're experiencing them back to back? That kind of thing.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned you've been working on this for 3 years, because I had assumed You mentioned that the success of things like Pillars of Eternity had contributed to the publisher's willingness to work with you on this, and I thought
Yes.
that meant when the game launched, but you mean when it crowdfunded, like back in
Crowdfunded,
2012,
yes.
2013, yeah.
Yeah, basically when Pillars was like completely like overshot all of our projections for how well it would do on crowdfunding, and we basically within like slightly more than a day we met our initial target and then went on to almost 4 times what our initial goal was for the game. Like that level of success was really what was able to say, hey, there's more options here than just Pillars. We can look at use that as a way to talk to other publishers about how successful this type of game can be, and making more games like it is actually a viable option.
Right. I actually want to rewind a bit and talk about choice design. It's one of the evergreen topics here on the. It's just so interesting, the different approaches, and I like what you said, that how you said there are different degrees of consequences. Like you're trying to make the best decision you can with incomplete and imperfect information. Can you talk about the guidelines when deciding or when designing a game for interesting choices and consequences?
So I think it's there's always a balancing act, because you want to give players enough information that they feel like that they understand the choice they're going to make and it fits within the context of the story they're experiencing at this point. But you also want to leave room for surprise, because if every choice the player made played out exactly the way they expected it to based on the information they had, the story would be boring. They're no longer going to be challenged. They're no longer going to be surprised. There was the writing course I took many years ago where the guy who was giving the speech had this thing like, if you ever write a scene where a character walks up to a door, knocks on it, and then is immediately let in, you just wasted your and the audience's time for however long that scene took to play out. There has to be some conflict, some pushback on the characters and the viewer's expectations in order for there to be interesting drama. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with a lot of our choices, is create situations where there's some amount of players expecting that things are playing out the way they would want them to, but also having reactions that are true to the characters they're interacting with, but will still be some level of surprise for the player. So when we're looking at like a decision, one of the things we're doing in Tyranny is obviously we're not trying to make the good versus evil distinction. Like a lot of RPGs, you'll have the 5 different varieties of being a good guy, and then maybe there's the evil choice, which is just attacking and killing people. And for us, that wasn't the type of character we're trying to allow the player to play here. We want the different choices to be different ways to react and manipulate and work with the factions that you are experiencing, the different characters. So different ways to modify and build reputations, different ways to play out an evil power fantasy by certain choices you have different ways to decide, oh, this character is going to die. Well, how are they going to die? I can now choose to be slightly more merciful in how they die, maybe giving them a swift execution, or setting them to be tortured and killed over long periods of time. Like, giving the players those different choices, it's a different style of power fantasy for the player, but it does build on like that classic idea of like giving the player choices and seeing how those